Welcome to Mutcho Radio, where we share African descent stories our way. My name is Marat Nahimana. I'm a Mutcho Radio young journalist and Black Diplomats Academy 2023 fellow. Our guest today is Honorable Marilou McPhedran, the Independent Senator of Manitoba. For those who don't know you, who is Marilou McPhedran?
Well, I would start by saying thank you, Marat, to you for this opportunity to have this interview with you, and say that in many ways, I think my childhood shaped who I am as an adult. I was raised in a small prairie town called Neepawa, Manitoba, with two younger sisters, and my dad was a large animal veterinarian who was away a lot. He used a plane to get to a lot of the farms that he was going to. And so we were really raised in many ways quite independently. So we would go off on our own. And those were obviously days long before anything like a cell phone. And basically nobody knew who we were till we showed up at the end of the day when we got hungry. And that kind of independence has really been a part of my life ever since I was a child. It shows up where I work now in the Senate of Canada in the fact that I'm not part of any of the groups that are defined, the political groups that are defined inside the Senate. And that has really suited me, who I am, much better than having to deal with leadership that sometimes I would find very difficult to comprehend.
As a political science student myself, I would like to know more about the Senate's role.
The Senate exists because of the Constitution of Canada. It was created to be, in the words of some at the time, a place of, quote, sober second thought. Many governments have only one parliament, one house of parliament, but Canada and the US both have two houses of their parliaments. In Canada, what we call the Senate is the appointed house. So up until this current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in 2015 was elected, senators, for the most part, were appointed because they had served one or more of the political parties particularly well, and also because they were accomplished people, for the most part. Up until 2015, the vast majority of senators who were appointed were white men, usually wealthy or very financially comfortable white men who were also very much part of the machinery of whatever ruling party had the prime minister, who would at that time use the prime minister's power to simply, make a call, ask someone who was loyal to the party, would you serve in the Senate? And if they said yes, very soon thereafter they would become a senator. The system changed very substantially in 2015. Justin Trudeau promised, if he was elected, that he would create a more independent Senate. And as it happens, when he became Prime Minister, almost half of the Senate was empty. There are 105 seats, and at that time, there were more than 50 empty seats in the Senate. And that had to do with the fact that the previous Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, was not very much a fan of the Senate. He actually felt that the Senate should be abolished because it is an appointed house. And so after very strategically creating a loyal and effective number of appointments to the Senate of Conservatives that worked very closely with the Prime Minister, he just stopped making appointments. And that means that in 2015, the way opened up for Justin Trudeau to, what is now the case, have appointed close to a majority of the senators who are currently in office. However, the procedure changed. No longer is it a simple phone call from the Prime Minister. There were regional committees that were created, and citizens who had demonstrated their commitment to community were asked to serve as interviewers, selectors, to make a short list from their particular region. So in my case, there was an advisory group of 3 citizens who had a list, who put my name on that list. And the application process has also changed. Anybody in Canada now who is over 30 is able, if they meet the other criteria, to apply online, to fill out the application, to on their own initiative, to say, I would like to serve in the Senate. I have to say to you that I just recently got a letter from an 11-year-old girl in British Columbia who said, I want to be a senator. How do I become a senator? So it's a very interesting range of opinions about the Senate, including those, as with the previous prime minister, who believe that the Senate should not exist. But in 2012, there was a Supreme Court of Canada decision about that very question. Should we have an appointed Senate in Canada? Can the government get rid of the Senate? And the answer that came back from the Supreme Court of Canada was the Senate of Canada is entrenched within the Constitution of Canada and has been so for 150 plus years. And no prime minister, no government has the power to unilaterally get rid of the Senate. It would have to be a full constitutional amendment. And in Canada, the constitutional amendment process is very demanding, very unlikely that amendments will occur because you need close to unanimous agreement among the governments at the federal level as well as all the governments at the provincial and territorial level. So I would sum up by saying the Senate is here to stay. The appointment process for the Senate now allows for genuine independence. It's not a matter of whether you're a loyal party member and a loyal fundraiser for a party. That now appointments are made through this process where it filters up to the Prime Minister, a small list of names given to the Prime Minister, and from that small list of names, where the Prime Minister has had no involvement in the process up to that point, the recommendation comes to the Prime Minister from a national volunteer committee that has reviewed all of the applications, and then the Prime Minister chooses one of those names from that short list, sends it over to the Governor General and says, this is who I recommend for appointment.
Wow, this is such a wealth of knowledge that I'm trying to absorb here.
Well, as a political science student, I think one of the questions that's still out there is what is the accountability of the Senate? You know, the House of Commons is an elected body, and members of Parliament have to go to their constituents, and they have to convince their constituents that they've done a good enough job to be re-elected or to be elected. And senators are appointed, and we are appointed to a mandatory retirement age of 75, which is the same as for the Supreme Court of Canada. And we have senators, not many, but we have senators who are in their 40s. So if they continue to serve to senators to the age of mandatory retirement, they will have spent the majority of their adult life as senators, never ever having to go back to an electorate to be validated. And that, I think, is a very legitimate question that should be continued to be looked at.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And as a senator, how do you feel when your motion is accepted and your community announces it?
Well, a motion or a bill are two very different things in both the House of Commons and the Senate. A motion is to be voted on, and it expresses the shared opinion of a majority of the senators who vote in favor of the motion. Let me give you two examples of motions. One was a motion by Conservative Senator Leo Housakis, who has a very strong human rights record, for the Government of Canada, the Parliament of Canada, to recognize that what was happening in Myanmar and then caused Rohingya people to have to leave, where we now have the largest refugee camp in the world is Rohingya, and Bangladesh, over 1 million, spread out in more than one camp, that that amounted to a genocide. For Rohingya, and a similar motion by Senator Housakis was what is happening by Chinese treatment of Uyghur peoples is also a genocide. We have had the motion on the Uyghurs defeated in the Senate. There were senators, the majority of senators. I voted and very strongly supported Senator Housakis, but a majority of senators did not. And a whole group of us are looking at trying again, because there's a very strong feeling that indeed this is still going on and it does need to be recognized. Another motion was brought by me dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and especially responding to the evidence. We now have much more evidence after more than 400 days of this war, but this happened much earlier, and my motion was to declare the illegal invasion of Russia of Ukraine by Russia to be a genocide of the Ukrainian people, and that motion passed. So, how does it feel? I mean, I was very committed to reaching out ahead of time on very short notice, so lots of early morning phone calls to all of the leaders of the groups to try and convince them to be ready to vote, even though it was on very short notice, because the House of Commons had already passed the same motion the day before. And I felt very strongly that Canada as a country needed to stand up for Ukraine, and in particular our parliament. Both houses of our parliament needed to make the same strong statement about the genocidal nature of the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I was really pleased because my motion passed, even though there was very, very little notice ahead of time for it. And now, I mean, that in that moment, that made Canada the first parliament in the world to declare what Russia was doing against Ukraine to be a genocide. And I've heard from Ukrainian activists, Ukrainian parliamentarians, the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, that this really made a difference to how Ukrainians felt supported by Canada.
Who are the people who inspired you growing up?
Well, my teachers from the time that I entered grade 1 in that little small town, my teachers were a huge influence. As it happened, because it was not that typical, my principal when I was in grade 1 was a woman, and I had women teachers for pretty much all the way through including until I got to high school. And I was told over and over again by those teachers and by my principal that I was a leader, and that I needed to prepare myself to be a leader, not only as a child, but also as an adult. And I remember one day my principal saying to me, after I had organized, I think it was maybe a concert of grades, of the lower grades, grades 1 through 4, and I had decided that we needed to have a concert. And I had organized this concert, and afterwards, my principal said to me, her name was Ruth Ferry, and she said to me, "You could be prime minister. If you're organizing something like this when you're 7 years old, you could be prime minister." And that kind of positive reinforcement really makes a difference. The other thing I would say is that I was the firstborn of 3 daughters, and we had a father who loved us, no question, but he told us on more than one occasion that he wished he had a son. But since he didn't have a son, he was going to treat his daughters like boys. So we were raised essentially like boys, and had a lot of freedom, and spent a lot of time building things, planning things, taking initiative. And by the time I got to high school, my leadership had really gelled to also my circle of friends and my circle of girlfriends in high school. And to be honest with you, Marat, we ran pretty much everything in our high school. So by the time I got to university, it was really the first time that I came up against discrimination against me based on the fact that I was female. I just hadn't had that experience until I was 17 years old. And it was quite a shock to be seen primarily because I was female. And there were a lot of really interesting experiences starting in university where I really had to wake up to the fact that in the whole world, the vast majority of women in the world live their lives every single day facing discrimination because they're female.
I agree with the positive reinforcement part. It is very important to give positive feedback to kids so then they start to build upon their leadership very early on. Well, talking about inspiration, um, see, my parents are from Burundi, and Mandela was a peacemaker for our country. So to have in Winnipeg the Human Rights Museum with the biggest Nelson Mandela exhibition, what does it mean to you to have such an exhibition in Winnipeg?
Well, I'm very, very lucky because my home in Winnipeg is 21 floors up, and I look straight out to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights whenever I look out my window. And that itself is inspiring. The architecture is inspiring. Is if you have you had a chance to visit?
No, I haven't visited Winnipeg yet, but it's on my bucket list.
Good, because when the museum was being designed and built, the leader in the Winnipeg community, who was the person primarily responsible for making the museum reality, is an amazing woman named Gail Asper. And Gail Asper kept saying to the people of Winnipeg, when we get this museum done, it will be the first and only museum in the world dedicated exclusively to human rights. And the architecture needs to reflect that because people are going to start to come to Winnipeg because they want to visit this museum. And that has happened. That has definitely happened. And the museum is a very unusual structure. There's nothing else like it that looks quite like it at this point anywhere in the world. And it works its way as a spiral up to a tower, which is called the Tower of Hope, which is entirely glass. And so not that many people have the perspective I do of being able to look at the museum from a bit of a distance, but to see all of it and to see it at night. And it always is like a shining beacon of light on the plains of Manitoba. It's also built at what is a very significant, in all of Canada, or all of Turtle Island really, Indigenous meeting place. The Indigenous elders have said for thousands of years that there are actually four rivers at all meeting at the same place, and the museum is built right at this meeting place. Two of the rivers flow underground and you don't see them. Two of the rivers, the Red River and the Assiniboine River, are very large, powerful rivers that converge at what is called the Forks. And that is where the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is situated. And one of the things that happened in the building of the museum was the acknowledgement that this museum was being built over ancient meeting place with some very important artifacts from thousands of years of Indigenous civilization. And so every one of the heavy metal supports for this museum that have to go down very deep into the earth before they were completed, when the digging was happening, Indigenous elders held ceremony at the base, deep down in the earth, and left spiritual bundles, and asked for the blessing of the ancestors for the building of this new museum. And there has been a very strong emphasis by Indigenous leaders on the need not only for the museum to be built with sensitivity and respect for Indigenous cultures, but also for every single day, for how the museum operates, for what is displayed in the museum, for the management of the museum, that Indigenous leadership needs to be part of that. Now, it's not for me as a non-Indigenous person to make a judgment on that, but I will say that it has not been an entirely smooth road. I will say that we have had some very thoughtful criticism from some of the Indigenous leaders in Winnipeg, and sometimes I think the museum has been able to pivot and respond, and other times I think it's an ongoing challenge. The current leadership of the museum is very strongly committed to being responsive. And so I think there's been less in the way of community criticism, but this will always be a tension. This will always be a responsibility that the museum is going to have to over and over and over again find a way to live up to those promises.